Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to take just a few more seconds for more people to trickle in. We're also streaming on Facebook, so we're going to get that set up, but just give us one moment and we'll get started. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We're having some tech problems, but we have someone on the back end, Hassani Stenson. If you wanted to turn your camera on and introduce yourself really briefly, she's going to be doing the Q&A chat. She's going to be just getting your questions and compiling them as we are answering them and making sure everything on Zoom is running smoothly as well as the Facebook stream. So hi, Hassani, if you want to introduce yourself really quick.
Hi, everyone. Of course, if you have any questions, you can come to me. I'm going to be working in the background and making sure things run smoothly. So any questions I get from the chat, I will be putting them into the conversation. And if you have any questions for me, then let me know in the chat and we'll help you out. Thanks.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much, Hassani. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Tiana Williams. I'm the creator of Black August Archives. We are the host of this webinar today. I'm really excited to get into this really amazing conversation with the panelists that I have assembled for you here today on documenting and archiving the movement. Before we go any further, I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge what today is. Today is February 21st. It has been 56 years. It's 56 years to the day that Malcolm X was assassinated. So I just thought that was something to put out there as we're getting into all of this history and talking about documenting past and present movements. It's just something to keep on our hearts and minds in honoring our ancestor, Malcolm X, who was a proponent for Black liberation in all forms. Okay, so once again, if you have problems with the webinar, we're trying to get the live stream working on Facebook. Just hit up Pasani in the chat if you have any issues. And then I'm going to just introduce my project, Black August Archives, and then introduce the moderator for the evening, and then we'll get into it. So a little bit about Black August Archives and my work, as well as the inspiration for this webinar. As many of you know, the archive was recently launched this month and made available. But essentially, Black August Archives is an archive that is dedicated to documenting, collecting, and preserving histories of freedom fighters and radical light. So we work to digitize and collect material from various social political movements, most notably that of the prisoners movement from the 1960s and 70s, which birthed the Black August Organizing Committee, what is also known as the Black August tradition. So Black August is essentially about resistance, and in particular resistance behind prison walls. So this archive is just really dedicated to bringing some of that history to the forefront, preserving and collecting those histories that often go obscured and unnoticed. So yes, I'm going to be in the position of a panelist today, but I'm also just really excited to learn from the different archives that we will have here today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for the evening, and then we'll get into this really amazing conversation with these archivists. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that. Kalechi A. Ohiri, which is our moderator for the evening, is a community organizer and scholar activist who earned her Bachelor of Arts in Sociology with an emphasis in organizational studies from the University of California, Davis. She is currently pursuing a master's in higher education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. As a scholar, she's interested in examining intercommunal relationships among Black students in higher education and the effects of higher education institutions on Black communities. Her latest project engages in the work of memory making, recording the intellectual and interpersonal lineages of Black women professors in higher education, stemming all the way back to the introduction of Black studies after the Civil Rights Movement. She's interested in archiving as an act of breathing life and infusing color into the archives. So, welcome, Kalechi. We're really excited to have you here and moderating and facilitating um, this discussion today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tiana, for that really kind introduction and bio. Hi, everyone. We are so happy that you are here today with us. I want to welcome everyone just once again to Documenting and Archiving the Movement presented by Black August Archives. This is great work, really important work. So we are happy that you are here today to hear about it. I also want to mention that today would have been Nina Simone's 88th birthday. So happy birthday to our ancestor, Nina Simone. Once again, we are so privileged to have you here, and we are also extremely privileged to have a panel of wonderful experts in this work. So I am so excited for them to get up here and just share what they know. But before we do that, let's go ahead and do just a little bit of really quick housekeeping here to make sure we're all on the same page. Once again, we have a Q&A section, so should you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A. If you are joining us from Facebook, hey y'all, welcome Facebook family. You can also drop your questions in the comments, and the lovely Asani will make sure that we get all those questions so that we can have a really robust conversation here. As far as community guidelines, we just ask that folks keep it respectful in the Q&A. Once again, we have such amazing people here to speak with us, and they want to share the knowledge that they have. So let's just keep it respectful so that we can have a great conversation here today. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into the various archivists that we have joining us. The first archive we have joining us is Interference Archives, located in Brooklyn, New York. They work to explore the relationship between cultural production and social movements. The archive contains many kinds of objects that are created as part of social movements, but the participants themselves, by the participants themselves rather, such as posters, flyers, publications, zines, books, t-shirts, buttons, moving images, audio recordings, subject files, and other materials. This work manifests in an OpenStack archival collection, publications, a study center, and public programs, including exhibitions, workshops, talks, and screenings. Interference Archive is a collectively run space that is people-powered with OpenStacks and accessibility for all. We have two Interference Archive volunteers with us today, Sophie Glidden-Lyon and Jen Oyer. Thank you so much for being with us today and representing Interference Archives. Welcome, y'all. All right. We have the Freedom Archives located in San Francisco, California. They are a nonprofit educational archive dedicated to the preservation and dissemination of historical audio, video, and print materials, documenting progressive movements and culture from the 1960s to the 1990s, along with producing original documentaries and educational resources for use by schools and organizations. The Freedom Archives offer youth development programs focused on engagement with these historical materials and provide media production training. Speaking on behalf of Freedom Archives is Nathaniel Moore, an archivist and co-director for Freedom Archives. Thank you so much for being with us here, Nathaniel. Yes, so lucky to have y'all. Project Stand is our third archive joining us here today. They are a radical grassroots archival consortia project between colleges and universities around the country that work to create a centralized digital space highlighting analog and digital collections that emphasize student activism in marginalized communities. Project Stand aims to foster ethical documentation of contemporary and past social justice movements in underdocumented student populations. Project Stand's nationwide community consists of archivists and memory workers, student activists and organizers, as well as educators, historians, and researchers. Today we have Holly Smith, the college archivist at Spelman College and member of Project Stand, along with Lael Hughes-Watkins, the university archivist at the University of Maryland and founder of Project Stand. Thank you both for being with us today. Last but not least, we have It's About Time, located in Sacramento, California. It's the official website of the Black Panther Party alumni, as well as an archive dedicated to preserving the history and legacy of the Black Panther Party. Focusing primarily on the party's rank and file workers, the archive collects material from numerous archivists and activists and former Black Panthers. Its founder, Billy X. Jennings, joined the Black Panther Party at the age of 17 and began working out of the East Oakland Black Panther Party office. During his time as a Panther, Jennings was selected to work on the very first free breakfast program at St. Augustine Church in Oakland and became a personal aide to Dr. Huey P. Newton, and even served as a pallbearer in the memorial services for freedom fighters and revolutionaries, George and Jonathan Jackson. It's About Time, Black Panther Party Alumni Archive, ultimately began as a result of Dr. Huey P. Newton's archive being sold off to Stanford University in the 90s, inspiring Jennings to create an archive with special emphasis on the Black Panther Party and its alumni members. Thank you for being here with us today, BJ, and for representing It's About Time archive. So as you can see, we have a phenomenal all-star panel to talk to us today about the work of memory making, about archiving, and about documenting the movement. So I'm going to pose the first question that we have to all of our archivists to kind of answer, riff off one another, and just, spit some knowledge for us. But we're curious, what defines a liberatory community-based archive, and how does that differ from traditional archives? Take it away, y'all.
Well, this is out of my character, but I'm happy to get started. In the interesting of stretching ourselves in growth. First of all, again, a huge thank you to Tiana and Kelechi and Hassani for organizing and facilitating, and to my wonderful comrades and colleagues. I'm looking forward to learning as much. And Kelechi, that's a wonderful question. And I think in terms of, granted, being at an institution, but at an HBCU situated in an archive, is situated in a progressive radical space, and being a part of Project Stand with the idea of, grassroots organization to support student activists. When I think of a liberatory archives, I just truly think of an institution, but individuals that are truly rooted in not the language of diversity and inclusivity, but equity and justice. And what does it really mean to have welcoming, encompassing spaces that don't replicate systems of oppression, even in collecting practices, or who you document, or how can we tell complex, comprehensive stories? And I know we'll get into that further, but in just and equitable and respectful, not respectability politics, but being respectful of people, stories and their desire to not be documented. So I just look at it as a physical freeing and intellectually and emotionally freeing space, where there's the desire to complicate what an archive can be physically. It's not just papers, but it's often the embodiment, the memories of individuals. So I just think about a liberatory space as just using your language, freedom.
The reason we started It's About Time was to make our history and bring our history together, because many former members of the Black Panther Party's stories haven't been told. And it seems like the media, or those that do deal with the media, only deal with the leadership, which is Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver. But there was 5,000 other brothers and sisters across this country doing fantastic work. So our archive is focused on what happened in the Black Panther Party and what happened after the Black Panther Party, in terms of how the legacy has grown, what it is today. And so, as for me starting the archive, it was a way to document our history for our kids and for those that come after us.
I think for me, thank you everyone, first off, for thinking of interference. Thank you, Tiana, for thinking of interference and asking us to be here today. I was in school for archives when I first found Interference and first started volunteering with Interference. And what was so radical about Interference for me, especially really being immersed in the very professionalized, institutionalized world of archives, was two things that I'm sure Jen and I will talk about a fair amount here today, so I won't get too into it, but the fact that we're volunteer run completely, and the fact that we are an OpenStax archive, which means, for anybody who's watching who maybe hasn't heard that phrase before, we have no, where we try to have no barrier to access. So there's no paperwork to fill out. You don't have to make an appointment. You can walk in our front door, and now that we're in a space that has a storefront and is ADA accessible, especially, means that you really can open the door and walk in, and we want you to pick up a box and open it and touch the stuff and use it and explore it. We exist as an organization to kind of steward this material and protect it, but not from its users and not from the people, especially because, you know, we think of this material as being created by movements and should be used by movements. So the OpenStax really kind of changed my thinking about how archives can work and how they should work, and has definitely informed my sense of what a liberatory archive could be. But I think it is a constant process, right? There's no kind of point where you can say, okay, we're done. We're done now. We're totally liberated. So for Interference, that was a big part of it.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit onto what Sophie mentioned. And also thank you for having us here today. And it's really exciting to see a lot of past and present, and I hope future Interference Archive friends in the attendee list. So we have to like take any opportunity to connect right now, and it gives me warm fuzzies to see familiar names. But when I think about aspects of our work at Interference that feel liberatory, one thing is rethinking who can be an archivist, and thinking about what skills or training are necessary, and actually maybe the things we learn in library school are not all the skills, and so setting up mechanisms for skill sharing across all different kinds of knowledge. And the other thing is rethinking what preservation means. Maybe preservation isn't preserving the formal qualities or prioritizing the formal qualities of all this material here, but maybe it's prioritizing the ideas of all of these movements. And how can we best honor and preserve those ideas? Well, probably by using them and getting them into people's hands and doing exhibits of this material and having events that foster discussion. So we talk a lot about preservation through use, and that guides things like our OpenStax policy and a lot of other ways that we set up our work.
Thank you all for adding that. I think Sophie and Jen brought up really excellent points about accessibility, and I'm really excited that we're starting to talk about that. We will get more into that in just a moment. But for now, I'd like to talk more about the technicalities of archiving. I know, Sophie, you mentioned, and Holly alluded to a little bit, about how professionalized and institutionalized archiving can be. I know Jen was bringing in a little bit about like the skills that are literally taught in library school, right? Like how is it that people archive, and how is it that this thing has been taught? I'm really interested if you all could speak a little bit, if you have, you know, some experience in your work, about the challenges of engaging in memory making within a major institution, or within like a professionalized space. Like, how are you finding those spaces for liberatory thinking or actioning or activism within very institutionalized spaces or in an institutionalized trade?
I will say that, you know, as we were answering that amazing question earlier, like what is a liberatory archive? I mean, definitely the challenge is trying to bring that framework, that viewpoint into these quote unquote traditional spaces. And it is not built for us to try to implement that philosophy, that lens into our work. So it's a constant uphill battle of trying to undo, unlearn what we are told in our iSchool classes and in our IMOS programs. The collection development policies to our preservation practices to how we decide what our metadata is going to be is all conflicted with these approaches that are Westernized, Eurocentric approaches to our work. So in trying to make some headway, I'm constantly thinking about, I do a lot of work, as you already said earlier, with student activism in traditionally underdocumented communities. So we at UMD, it's been really important through Project Stand, with Project Stand, implementing some of our work at Project Stand, to create transfer forms for students. Normally when we think about documentation and acquisitions, we always think about the alumni or what we get from our offices, our administrative offices on campus, but then we are not traditionally giving that kind of agency to the students that we're working with, and definitely students in our vulnerable and traditionally, again, Black and brown and underdocumented communities. And so like making sure they're aware and understand like what is the process, what is that we're doing with these records that you have so kindly allowed us to help steward your stories and your legacies, and making sure that they have agency and understand what that work means, and engaging in a participatory approach to that work.
I just want to add to a couple things that folks have said, and also just circle back to the Liberatory Archive for 1 minute. Thanks so much for having the Freedom Archives and for all the folks who are joining us. I think unlearning is a big thing, a big concept that drives the Freedom Archives work. That a lot of the ways in which people are socialized to engage history is focused on, as Billy said earlier, kind of folks with big names or leadership, or who have achieved some sort of social status or have wealth, or all the different, and additionally gender and race and class and all the like ability, all these things play roles in terms of how we engage information and how we understand information as important or unimportant, or perspectives as important or unimportant. And people, even if they don't know that they're doing it, they take that with them as they move through the world. And so one of the things that we really want to focus on at the Freedom Archives, and we do it through the mechanism that we do it is a lot through our internship program, but really focusing on the unlearning. And so when young people come into the archives, really trying to both demystify history, that it's something that we all take place in every single day. All of us are history makers and memory, creators, whether or not we know it or want to be or not. And that actually we have agency over what we do and how we engage in changing the narrative. And so through our in this case, our internship program, oftentimes young people who may come in with, a very kind of traditional view of history and their role in it in terms of what they've been exposed to in schools, have an opportunity to engage archives and perspectives, often created by people of the same age as they are, or coming from similar situations that they may be coming from. They have an opportunity to use those memories to then create. And so then they feel, and people know that they're a part of a larger trajectory and a larger arc of struggle or engagement. And these are really important in terms of shifting the ways that people understand the world around them. And then what we would like to think is amplifying agency in terms of then when they go out, what role they can play in terms of challenging some of the other norms in society that we would like to see changed. And then the only thing I just want to circle back to in terms of the Liberatory Archive, and one of the, I think another important practice is, it is really important to save people's perspectives, but it's saving just to save at a certain point just becomes what is a massive collection of data. And so one of the things that also we think is important is, how do we take the memories and actually repurpose them to feed back into the movements that they came from. And so one of the ways that we like to do that is, through creating media, whether it be smaller projects or like full-length documentaries, and really using those as organizing tools so that the work of people who came before doesn't just stand as an isolated historical event, but instead becomes part of what is our struggle or our work, and we all see ourselves as a part of that larger dynamic. So again, kind of increasing the agency that we all actually play a role in creating history.
One of the unique things about our archive is we started putting our archive on the internet in 1998. We started collecting stories, videos, photographs, and started telling the story of the Black Panther Party from the internet. And because of my role in the Black Panther Party, many people know me. And when I think of the Black Panther Party in organizing and putting archives together, I think 40 officers of the Black Panther Party. I don't think Oakland. I think about New York, Chicago, Houston, all those different chapters, all those Fred Hampton people that I know who are out there doing great work. And a lot of times their history is lost in the maze of individual people like who have names in the Black Panther Party. So the thing about our archive is that young people, our kids, our grandkids can go to the website and find out things about their particular geographical location. They don't have to focus in on Oakland. They can focus in on Detroit or another geographical location, because we carry articles from the Black Panther Party newspaper. There's a whole section on the Black Panther Party newspaper, what was inside the Black Panther Party newspaper, and so forth. So we use media at the maximum. And because we do exhibits along with our archiving around the world, if you go to our website, many of our videos are in 4 sections, because in different parts of the world where we travel to doing Black Panther Party exhibits, they don't have direct Wi-Fi. So we broke it down into quarters so it'd be easy for them to download the story of the Black Panther Party on our internet. So we needed a central mothership for this information to start coming out, and It's About Time Archive provided that mothership type of information, because like I said, I worked at Central Headquarters and I know the founders of the Black Panther Party then as well as now. So archiving is still important because of the lessons it teaches young people today, because our website brings in a lot of intake from colleges, schools, high schools across the whole nation. So from that one website, it pulls a lot of attention because it's telling the rank and file story of the Black Panther Party. And many people want to know that.
Thank you for that. We already have so much good input. There's so much to kind of riff off of and take the conversation a couple different places. I'm holding on to a couple of things that I want to explore more. I think, Nathaniel, you made the excellent point of talking about archiving in service of movement. And I think BJ was wonderfully poetic that you came in after that and also talked about the youth, right? Youth coming in, understanding the archives, seeing what was happening in the archives, getting a broad view of history. So I'm really curious about you all's thoughts on archiving as a service, right? As a service of impacting future trajectories of movements. How does archiving the past help us inform movements of the present? And I think as you are answering that, I'd love if you all could also kind of speak to what folks are doing currently and the way documentation has changed. We all have these phones, right? We all have these lovely things and we're all doing this type of archiving. So if you all could speak to like archiving today and how all of this is in service of current movements, I think that would be so great.
Well, I think, and I just really love what Nathaniel and Mr. Jennings were just saying, because it reminds me of the concept of memory work as a term that unites us. We're all memory workers. I think sometimes, unfortunately, in the traditional sense, we can get very caught up in, well, I was trained as this archivist and I was trained this way and I went to that school. But we're all involved in, like you said, the care and importance and veneration of the ancestors, the communities we inhabit, and ourselves. So that's, I think, one of the nice things that really unites us. And back to that great question, Kelechi, thinking around, working with my sister colleague, Lael Hughes Watkins, and she's going to get her flowers now while she's here, like just really being the driving force in the team, and really seeing this as a service-oriented mission to work collaboratively, like you said, with student, former student activists and current. I cheated a little and I peeked at the Q&A. I couldn't resist. And someone really asked a great question about, documentation. I believe it was, queer and indigenous community, and students doing a lot of work. So like you said, with an eye on certainly capturing the memories, experiences and stories of the elders, but what is going on right now and how can we do that collaboratively and, like you said, in ethical ways. And I know we'll talk more, probably about maybe specific tools and documentation. And forgive me, I'm a Southerner and a talker, so I might be going off on a tangent and forgetting the original question, but it makes me think it like really has to be a truly collaborative and not co-optive effort. And not forgetting that just myself as identifying as a Black woman, I can perpetrate white supremacy, unfortunately, the same way that somebody else could. So just being, I think, mindful of our own, blind spots and doing a lot of listening. But also, like you said, in the case of Project Stand, I know Lael will, and I will talk more. There were some really great, wonderful community conversations based at universities, but with current and former student activists, scholars, alumni, people involved in digital media. And it was just a really great conversation and to keep going, if that made sense. So thinking back to the liberatory promise of archives, and I think again about what Nathaniel was doing, kind of undoing the notion of what does it even mean to be an archivist. So we're not passive keepers of dead records. We should be seen as active stewards, actively working to provide access to memories and documents or things that shift and change over time. So I see what we do should be in service to each other and to our diverse communities that we inhabit.
I wanted to go off of what Holly was just speaking about in terms of listening and working collaboratively, especially with Black August Archives, and knowing that it's heavily focused on prison resistance. I've never been incarcerated. I don't know what that experience is like. I don't know what that movement was like when Black August came to fruition. So it's really important for me as, I should say, a community-based archivist in training, because I'm learning from all of y'all to really make these networks with formerly incarcerated folks, with those who are still incarcerated, which is, difficult because of the way the system is set up. But these are things that we have to take into consideration. But I think, looking into the archive and also paying attention to what those who are formerly incarcerated or who are currently incarcerated, what they want to be archived, what they want to be in public view, and really taking into account their voices. I think placing their voices at the forefront is one thing that I want to really implement in my work as an archivist. So just in thinking about in working in service to others, I think listening, as Holly mentioned, is key, because like I said, like I've never been incarcerated. This essentially isn't my history, but I'm trying to repurpose this work for future, impacting future generations and impacting future trajectories of liberation. And how do we do that is with still making those ties and connections and networks with those who went through the experiences and are currently going through it. So that's just something I wanted to put out there with my positionality for that question that you posed, Kelechi.
I just want to, and Holly always do this to me, but I'm going to just want to say thank you for sis. This work for Project Stand could not happen unless you had amazing folks who will stand in that space with you and believe in the vision of the work. So that couldn't happen without folks like Holly Smith. So just want to make sure I put that out there and give her flowers too. But thinking about how, to your question, Kelechi, that how are we doing this work seeing this work as service, I think about Holly had mentioned about these amazing student organizers, past and present, that we had the opportunity to meet during some symposiums that we did over 2018, 2019. There was a phenomenal gentleman who's an organizer out in Chicago named Charles Preston, who has written for the Chicago Defender. And he organized the Save CSU, or something also known as Budget or Else campaign to keep Chicago State University open. And at one point during one of the questions we had for the student organizers, he mentioned about how the archive should be seen as a blueprint, and like this space of accountability as well. How important it is and how wonderful it is when we see the work of our forefathers and foremothers documented to help serve as that platform for the movement to continue to be able to go back and look into the archive and see those records there. I mean, how important it is to see those records there. But archives also being this space of accountability that can help change the trajectory of future movements. Because if your university or X institution said, we will give $100 million for X to help this, to help increase Black student admissions, or to promote an LGBTQ program, or to save this community, to save this community, and then to be able to go back in the archive and see that that promise was made because it has not been completed. Having that documentation there is so valuable and can help, again, to your question, change the trajectory of a movement when those records are available and accessible, and there's someone that you can go to, or community archive that you can go to and see that those records are available.
I've also been,
no, go ahead, Jen.
Okay.
It's going to happen eventually. I'm glad it was between us.
Cool. I was just thinking, as we're thinking about like the trajectory, how archives impact the trajectory of movements, I'm actually thinking a lot about something Nathaniel said about helping folks reorient their ideas about history and what is historical, because I can't even count the number of times I've seen someone come into Interference Archive and look at something and say, oh, that's my history. I didn't know that history belonged in archives. And it's like such a moving experience to witness. And I think that moment of belonging in itself can totally shape someone's trajectory for understanding themselves in the world, and like the potential that they have, the kinds of things that they can do and the impact they can have. So that in itself, even though it's perhaps a little like present or past oriented, I think can create a really important shift.
I want to, Sophie, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
All right. I wanted to also, just in terms of the idea of in service to movements, I just wanted to raise how knowing our history helps us better understand the strategy of the state. So if we're talking about movements, I think part of that is like, what are the movements trying to do? And so then, the state, right? It's we're trying to, whether it be challenge colonialism, challenge white supremacy, so then there is this thing that is saying, no, we want to keep this the way that the world is today, we're going to keep it going. And one of the things in the United States, which is a settler colony, I think that having an archive where you can reflect on the strategy of the state and the ways in which people have resisted and their stories and their strategies over time helps us be better informed in terms of how we want to engage today. And so it's more than just learning from our history. It's also about how do we most effectively create the world that we want to see. And I think a key component of the state strategy is to destroy communities by controlling their memory or disrupting their memory or disempowering people so that they don't think that, to the point that Jen just made, that they don't belong in terms of, whether that be in society or whether that be like in terms of the movement or their community or whatever it might be. And so one of the things, I'm just thinking about at the Freedom Archives, we've seen recently that even though we put out a documentary about COINTELPRO many, many years ago, that a lot of folks are still interested in that, and especially after the summer. And that's because, over the summer, many of the ways that the state engaged protesters and the narratives that they used and the strategies of I guess just the general state strategy of how it dealt with uprising, just to keep it as clear as possible, that having a background about COINTELPRO does not mean that, oh, we've got the answers, all we have to do is this and this and this, but it creates a fabric of a lot of these things are in fact not new. People have resisted them in the past. People have worked around some of these issues. And so not that, oh, we have to do the same thing, but without that knowledge, not only do we feel like sometimes we're fighting in a vacuum, but also I certainly would not be as sharp around political analysis if I didn't have an idea of what came before me. And so I think that also in terms of like how we engage with larger movements, there's both the personal about how do we empower people to engage, and then there's the larger in terms of there are already people that are engaging. So then archives also play a really pivotal role for those movements in terms of winning and whatever that looks like, so that we actually can see the world that we want to live in.
These are great points. Even in defining the win, right? Like, what does it look like to win? How do we define the win? So I really appreciate this. I think we were talking about future trajectories of liberation, and I heard a lot about accountability. I heard a lot about the passage of ancestral memory. I heard a lot about strategizing. So I'm picking up on what you all are saying, and these are great points. I think y'all are bringing us to a really, really interesting place. So the next question that I want to pose to everyone is really thinking about this passage of ancestral memory, right, that we're kind of alluding to here, right? How do we pass the word along? How do we make sure that what was done is being recorded? And thinking about the politics, right, and the dangers of archiving different histories that are in direct opposition to the establishment, in direct opposition to the state. How do we balance our community's needs for safety and access in doing this work? And how are you all taking that on? Let me reframe the question. I want to ask this question. I want to ask it in two parts. I want to ask it in what you all are doing in your specific archives in service of that. And then I also want to ask what you suggest that folks who are doing archiving in their own neighborhoods, who are trying to engage in this memory making work, how would you suggest they handle that question?
Well, our archive is different. It's privately owned and privately ran. So only person I'm accountable to is the archive, right? So there's no outlining corporation, any other entity. All the expenses fall on me. If I want to acquire equipment or some manuals or something I can't swap to get, I might have to buy, that falls on myself. But just like you mentioned before, if you're going to dare to struggle, you got to dare to win. So you can't be afraid to archive and do the job that you say you're going to do, So I can't speak to outlining influences like your university or who controls on your board of directors, anything like that. I'm speaking truth to power. That's what we're all about.
I'm sorry, Neil. Go ahead.
So you can go.
No, you go.
I will say it's definitely interesting, Holly and I are balancing like these spaces where we're a part of an institution, but we're also engaging in opportunities where we're able to work outside these institutional spaces. And so with Project Stand and again, trying to influence the institution that pays me my check, I'm trying to. I'm trying to make sure I'm able to provide opportunities again, because I'm very student centered and student organizer centered, social justice centered. I'm constantly trying to think about ways to protect the students who, again, who are coming to us, who are willing to have their work documented, but who are also, we also have to acknowledge, we've been acknowledging within Project Stand and other spaces, that students don't, that was something that we learned a lot during these symposiums, that again, students don't trust their institutions. Obviously, these are the spaces they're having these contentious relationships with. So then we as archivists work for these institutions in these contentious spaces. So we are seeing an extension of these institutions. And so one of the things that we heard on multiple times from students across geographical spaces saying that can I see you as a person? Can I see you as this individual that I'm trying to have this relationship, this conversation, and understanding with? So that was a very important lesson. And also understanding that we can't just be about, this is the conversation that's been going on for a while, but this can't be about extraction. Like, okay, it's all right. And again, unlearning, it's all right, and we have to be all right. If these student orgs and these vulnerable communities don't want to give us their collections, and they have the right to not want to give us their records. So, but we also want to help them preserve their records. And so we, engaging in a model, a post-custodial model that we're giving them advice and guidance to how to document and preserve their histories, whether they give us their collections or not, but they can do that within their community, and still pass that history and that knowledge on to the next generation who will come after them. And if that work does come to our space, what restrictions can we put on those collections? I have had conversations with students recently saying, okay, are there names in this collection that we should have removed from, so that it's not included in our metadata? How general do you want us to have description, or are we allowed to give some additional details about what you are protesting about? Like, should we think about scrubbing some of the photos? That's becoming a thing that newspapers are doing, taking those further aerial shots where you're not able to get that data and be able to identify folks. And so that's the kind of stuff we're trying to actively and consciously think about in traditional archives where we can, and push those boundaries, because that, again, has not been set up for us to have those kind of conversations, that kind of discourse.
And to follow up with, like, oh, I'm sorry, Sophie.
I will just say really quickly, Holly, and because interference, I think, does had to ask itself this question at its founding, in part because of volunteer labor and the nature of having that as a limited resource, but then also because of what we were documenting. So we don't accept photographs. People often will want to give us protest images, things like that, and we don't accept them. We don't want to put anyone at risk, but that we also don't really have the ability to restrict collections at all. So we decided early on that if there was any material that someone wanted to give us that would require restrictions, we wouldn't be able to accept it. And that way we sort of can have that OpenStax attitude without worrying about someone potentially being exposed to, police investigation or anything like that. So I will pass it off to Holly.
I'm so glad that we could be on Zoom, but I kind of wish we were in the same room together. That would be extra special, but down the line. No, thank you. So going off of Lael and Sophie's great points, just saying Project Stand has, and I'll drop the link in the chat in just a moment, but some really great, a toolkit that I think is extremely helpful that some of our colleagues, there's kind of a guideline exactly outlining what Lael and Sophie and all my other colleagues just mentioned on how to ethically be able to, do that in considerations. And to Lael's point, I remember being at a particular university, a predominantly white institution, where particular African-American student told me, we don't trust this institution and we don't want to give our materials. And they haven't been regarded anyway, so what can we do? So I think to the point, like we were talking about in-service and providing guides, that toolkit is something that I think would be really helpful for our co-conspirators and attendees today to take a look at as a guide. And I think going back to, really that great question, safely, I think a People's Archive of Police Violence in Cleveland is a really great model, as well as the Documenting Ferguson, thinking specifically about digital projects in media where people can upload and add their stories with as much or as little metadata. And several of our colleagues, Stacey Williams and Jared Drake, serve and others serve in advisory capacity. But like, we were talking about earlier, don't own it, or it's not an idea to appropriate people's stories, but to collaborate to guide, thinking again, like you said, about mitigating how these materials can be used by the state for, purposes of arrest and incarceration. I am very grateful to be attached to, again, the Women's Resource and Research. And I'll say something super briefly. So the Spelman Archives are actually on Spelman's campus, and we're part of the Women's Research and Research Center. And it was the vision of feminist icon and godmother in Black feminist theory, Dr. Guy Sheftall. So thankfully, whereas, like you said, different institutions have different challenges, our archives are institutionally already attached to a very radical progressive space. And Dr. Guy Sheftall, as an activist and really central again into dismantling systems of oppression, I'm very grateful that I don't have the same type of confines and can have these conversations, broadly and work with students equitably, whereas that has not always been the case. And frankly, is not, for a lot of colleagues. So yeah, those were two things that I was just, thinking in my, and like you said, that we're constantly, trying to be sure we don't want to perpetuate that same harm among people while we think about documenting and collaborating to tell stories.
We are having such a robust conversation, and a robust conversation also in the Q&A box. So I want to speed through some of these questions to make sure that we can keep having this conversation. Nathaniel, I saw that you unmuted real quick. Did you want to respond to something that was said?
I was just going to say one thing very, very briefly. I think that there's often a transactional idea that is linked to archives in terms of, someone has something and then they give it to someone else, but oftentimes it's grounded, and we could say capitalism, but at the very least, this transactional thing. And I think that not engaging in that is important. And so as an example, if someone came to the Freedom Archives and said, we gave a donation here, this is what it was, we'd want it back, we would like it back, we'd give it back. Right. And because it's theirs, right. And it's ours, but it's theirs. And so I think that also challenging the idea of ownership and who owns what, and that kind of came up in terms of one of the original questions around how do some of these more community-based archives work differently than institutional archives, where if you give something to an institutional archive, you are not getting it back. And so, or generally speaking, you are not getting it back. And so, I think that that's also an important part. And then being embedded in terms of accountability, if you're embedded in the communities that you're engaging with, all of this work is more of a conversation and a collaborative effort, even if you're the one that's undertaking it. And so I think that even if somebody, donates materials, what is preserving those relationships so that it really is a community space, as opposed to we might be progressive and we might be, doing social movements, but it's ours, right?
Thank you for adding that comment to the conversation. I think that's so valuable. I want to pose one more question and then really dive into some of the conversation we're having in the Q&A. But I think something that's being alluded to, and I would love if we could kind of just name it outright and ask the question, is memory a privilege? Who should have access to liberatory archives? And should all archives be public record for everybody in the public? I'm really interested in the different viewpoints of each of your archives and maybe your suggestions for folks who are doing community archiving themselves.
Anyone who's looking for the truth or looking for information that is hard to find, come to our website. Our website and archive is like a cross section of, we have a collection of underground newspapers.
I think BJ's having some technical difficulties, but that's okay. We'll get him back on. If anyone else wanted to answer that question, why contact him and try and see what happened?
I'll chime in quickly. So there's one thing I want to roll back though, Tiana, that was said earlier, conversation on a sense of belonging. And Holly mentioned Jared Drake. Jared Drake did an amazing keynote in 2016 on Liberatory Archives on belonging and believing. And I really strongly suggested, if any attendee had not read that already, that was a very powerful keynote that reminded me for sure about the importance of seeing yourself reflected in the archive. And that's really why I personally got engaged in this work, because I was looking for that reflection. So just the main piece, just please read it if you haven't. But again, personally for me, I feel the work as an archivist, just not for what institution or whatever institutions we're tied to or space we're tied, but just the work of a memory worker. I feel honored to get to do that work. So I do feel that having access to the memories of others is a privilege. And so I definitely feel that working with communities who do have to be worried about surveillance, retaliation, what channels can we provide those communities where their stories can be maintained, but not necessarily under the threat of that work being, of that documentation being weaponized against them. I think when we do the work that Burgess Jules, director of Doc Now, reminds us about, let the community lead, then those questions get answered. Because if the community is leading that work and those conversations, then we know what should be protected and not available to the larger society outside of that community. And then we'll know what is permitted and permissible to be made available outside of those communities. So whenever, to me, we let the community lead, we know what is vulnerable and shouldn't be made accessible and what should be.
I also think that archivists and museums as a sort of broader professional field have had a little bit of a reckoning over the last decade or so around Native American material held in institutions, and the effort to repatriate those items, but then also efforts to work with the tribes that are represented in those collections, so that even if maybe a community doesn't have the resources to maintain those items on their own, the museum essentially, in an effort to pay reparations, attempts to help them, through their guidance, store the items properly, make sure they're only being used by who, because many of these were sacred items. So I think while there is immense work on that sort of side of that question, because I think, we've been talking a lot about surveillance and the threat of police violence, which is extremely important. There is also a much larger question around access, and archivists, I think, have sort of swung from one end of the spectrum to the other in a lot of ways, where, it used to be this very gatekeeping position. You were only allowed in with the correct credentials, and that's certainly very true in a lot of places still. But now, as I was coming up through school, the conversation was more, no, complete, total open access. Everyone should have access to everything. There should be no barriers. It shouldn't matter who you are. And I'm really glad to have this conversation happening now, because it does speak to trying to find a little bit more nuance in that conversation, and understanding that while, knowledge should be accessible to anyone who seeks it, there are realities about the past of the archival profession, and then also the materials that archives and museums still hold today that we can't pretend don't need specific attention and care, and that we can't paint it all with a broad brush in one direction or the other.
Thank you for all of those different perspectives. Does anyone else have a response to that answer before we get into some audience Q&A?
Just wanted to say, and I see Mr. Jennings back. He was making an excellent point. No, we're so happy. So I'll say this quickly. And I was like, oh, I want to hear their point. And I know, I apologize. I'm getting a notification about unstable internet. So
Yes.
if I disappear, me too, Mr. Jennings. So if I disappear, I will be right back. But speaking, of accessibility, but in all seriousness, I'm thinking about the great points everyone said and what Nathaniel just said. It's important to emphasize that something doesn't have value just because it comes through the doors of the archive I work at. And I think, unfortunately, that has been the conversation around what's valuable, what constitutes archive worthy. And while, thinking about at Spelman, we do have a collection development policy because, we can't and shouldn't take in everything. But I think one of the most important things, and that I just love this conversation, and to Sophie's point, this needs to be more conversation in these more traditional spaces, is the idea of, again, what we're in service to do. And as a memory worker, my service would be to work with communities about the best, case scenarios and how it would work to preserve collectively. So things do not have to come through the doors of Spelman to, and like you said, it's not about a feather in my personal cap or just, like, oh, we got this. It's just like, is what I'm doing in service, like you said, to provide appropriate access. And again, we, really get into that. I know we'll get more into that conversation, but you're right. I don't think it's a one answer. I think it's something that constantly needs to be revisited, whether it's per collection, per project, or with like-minded colleagues like here. So we don't do things in isolation or in a vacuum according to just this theory or, what this institution says, as much as we can push back, again, to Mr. Jennings' point about having, to be beholden to a degree. But again, just the idea that we don't assign the value. So when we're talking to, individuals, and sometimes, I think about people who are very self-deprecating, like, well, what I have isn't important. It's not bad, but it's valuable to you. And so therefore it's valuable to me. And we'll have a conversation and support each other about, collectively how we can work together if the individual or entities choose to do so together.
Thank you all for these, just diverse perspectives on how to approach this important work. I want to get into some of these questions. We have some really great questions from the audience. One of the questions that we had was that I'm interested in the panel's perspective on how social media and other materials born on the web complicate and provide opportunities for archiving contemporary social movements. The question of the decade, right? So really interested in you all's thoughts on contemporary archiving, especially web-based archiving.
For myself, I see it as a bonus. I see it as a way to connect with other people who want to share as well. I get a lot of photographs, a lot of written materials through Facebook and other sources. So to me, that's a plus factor, because people are able to reach me and I'm able to reach them and ask them for specific things for our archive. Specific people that I know or might have what I'm looking for. A photographer who was taking pictures in the 1970s might have what I'm looking for, and through the internet, he might put some of those pictures on the internet, which I can track back to him and find out, do you have more of the same, or where were you at this particular day and time when you took this picture? So to me, it's a bonus. It's a way. It's like a bread trail. It could lead to other things.
I think the potentials for social media, I agree with Mr. Jennings on that point of, the networking and, making sure there's no duplication of work. If one archive is working on a sort of material and then another archive is just producing the same type of material, it's like, how can we come together and, maybe make some sort of project or conjoin what we're already working on? But I do think there are some complications with social media, especially like looking at Instagram and Facebook and how there's a lot of different pages that are developing that have that kind of claim to be in this position of archives with like photographs and then captions, the kind of posts that you kind of see people sharing where it's like, oh, did you know this history about this photograph? And then you fact check it or really dig into it and it's not necessarily true or factual. So I think social media is a really great space to kind of point to different resources and different archives that are out there, and the possibilities of archiving through social media is endless, but I think it can be complicated in certain ways if people are, for lack of a better word, doing it for clout or doing it for clicks or just doing it to get some traffic on their page, not for really, thinking about liberation and thinking about the dissemination of the history and information. So I think there's just a lot of different things to take into account with using social media as like an archiving space and platform. And you have to be very intentional about that.
Please go ahead. I think social media as a way to connect people is, obviously a very important tool, and, the past 10 years or 15 years, clearly demonstrates that people love it. And so I think it's going to be here one way or the other. I would just raise two, just kind of two things to, further, draw or further kind of, I don't want to say problematize, but just speak to the complexities. So the first is social media is owned by corporations that have no interest in people's liberation. I don't think that, I think that has to be understood. So that doesn't mean it can't be a cool tool to share things or interesting or that we can't use it in our lives. But I think I think we just have to think about that when we're playing out the dynamics. So that's one piece, right? And from what I think, if you post something on social media, they do own that. And then the second thing I think about is it is cool, and this got mentioned earlier, it is cool to save things. And because I like collecting in general, and I'm an archivist and I like history, I don't think I would ever tell someone to not save their stuff or not preserve their memory. But also some of this is about the meaning that we draw from it. It's not just about collecting for the sake of collecting. And so I would also raise that, right? One of the things with social media is very, very quickly, you have a huge quantity of data, essentially, or metadata or whatever. And if that's all it is, and, you're sharing, it's just 1,000 pictures or, yes, that's great. And individually, if you wanted to save that, that's cool. But if it is too much to draw meaning from, then we're all just, I would then just direct us to what is the goal of our efforts. If we're specifically talking about like documenting the movement, right? If we're talking about preserving our personal histories, that's a different conversation. And I would say, yeah, this stuff is great. But if we're talking about social movements, then drawing meaning from it is important. And without good mechanisms of engaging the data, then it's going to be hard to draw meaning from it. And so I think those are two things that, again, I wouldn't say anyone shouldn't do it. And there's lots of great toolkits. And I think some of them have been shared, and the ones that haven't, we can totally share out, that will create mechanisms for if people do want to document their social media, kind of good ways to do that. But I would just raise those 2 points in terms of, I think they're just part of the discussion.
I do want to add that, again, I'm going to invoke Documenting the Now again. They have an amazing white paper on the ethical documentation of social media that I strongly recommend for folks reading if you haven't done so. and I mentioned that because Documented Now has definitely impacted my views and definitely has been a part of how Project Stand is part of our discourse that we've been having around the ethical documentation of social media. One of the things is definitely, again, working with students, they don't always think about that people outside of their circle is looking at their tweets and their IG accounts. There was a student I was working with at my old job at Kent State, and she was a president at the time of this one student organization, and they were like communicating things during this protest that was occurring on campus, and they were worried about their own safety, and they were communicating using their Twitter account instead of, and so then like everybody could see that, and it just didn't dawn on that student group that was the case. And so that is as much as, you know, Nathaniel points out, like, yes, and Mr. Jennings has pointed out, yes, like social media has so many amazing, has been amazing in a lot of ways. I think about the democratization that has occurred. When you think about protests from Ferguson to a protest that happens at our colleges and campuses, a lot of times before social media, the administrative voice was like the thing, the police state was the thing, like that's what we were inundated with. And if you're lucky, as far as student groups, it would get in the student paper. And then that's where their demands would be communicated. Now their demands can be communicated on social media, and it's not just administration that's dominating the conversations. So that is such an important, one of the many important outgrowths of having those kinds of tools. However, as much as you can put your voice out there, that's also making you more vulnerable. Again, back to conversations we've been having around surveillance. One of the other things that I worry about is that because it is in this public square, in this public space, that just because I put it out there, that means I want you to document it. And that's not the case all the time. And like, you know, how many institutions, how many spaces are out there grabbing people's social media accounts, and they have not contacted the content creators for those accounts. Sometimes obviously we retweet a lot of stuff, but don't even know exactly where that tweet came from. And so they're trying to get back to the provenance of that record. And so there's a lot of challenges that are a part of documenting social media. And yes, to Nathaniel's point, that it's not going anywhere, but it's also such an important tool for the movement that we have to really be conscientious and continue to have thoughtful conversations around the ethical documentation of that content.
One other note, because of social media, I'm able to be in contact with comrades in Africa. You know, there was a group called the New Zealand Panthers, the Australian Panthers, the UK Panthers, and because of social media, I'm in contact with all those different groups in all those different countries. Because of social media, we had a 50-year reunion in 2016 in Oakland, and many of them came to Oakland because I was able to reach out to them and let them know we were doing this in October 2016. And many people journeyed here to Oakland to participate in the 50th. So there is a lot of benefits to social media, you know, and the way I use it is a benefit also for young people because they can ask direct questions. I think I'm the only Panther on the internet that will answer your email within 48 hours. If you send me an email and ask a question about a particular thing, like I got a question just the other day about women in leadership in the Black Panther Party. Many people don't know there was about 6 or 7 women who ran 6 or 7 different Panther offices across this country. You know, they were in charge. You know, they were the last word. Many people don't know that, you know, because we sit on top of this information and I have it, I'm able to disseminate it to different people who normally wouldn't have it, you know, like it's hardly a day passes that some student doesn't email me. They have a thesis, they're working on a project, or there's some news person or HBO is doing a special and they need some input. So to me, social media is working out fine for me.
I love that. And I think it's so interesting that you kind of brought up the idea of other entities using the archives. We got a fantastic question. They say, when I made my doc, Malcolm Echoes, The Legacy of Malcolm X, a lot of archives came from my family. However, the BBC also claimed ownership of the same archive and said that I should therefore license it, almost preventing us from using Malcolm X's archive in our film. What are your thoughts about decolonizing archival footage for indie filmmakers like myself, who ordinarily don't have film budgets large enough to pay for archives on screen? That's a fantastic question. I will turn it over to our panel of experts.
So I will say, I hear something like that, and frankly, it sounds absurd, and it really makes me think of, if you all are familiar with a Miss Tamara Lanier right now, who it's an incredible story, and I will find the link, but Harvard University Libraries possesses images of her family. It's kind of some iconic images, unfortunately, that we've seen of an enslaved men and women and Arinti, and is basically suing them like, okay, if these images now belong to history, but these are our families. So there's actually pending litigation. And in that case, I think about it as repatriation, right? Because pardon me, that was triggering, because I get very angry when and particularly when it comes to the history of historically marginalized communities or communities that have been marginalized. I think, so there's this idea of ownership, and particularly from these entities, that are, steeped in systems of oppression like white supremacy, homophobia, misogyny. But now, so there's these conversations around, accessibility, equity, and inclusion, but you need to pay me an exorbitant amount to use these materials for that access. So I think what Ms. Lanier is doing in her suit is just bringing up the great conversations around who owns what. And I think we're all here today because we're interested in the conversations around accessibility and archives broadly. But I think to Nathaniel's point, there's a capitalist element to the idea of, it's a lot about payment and ownership. And so thinking about decolonization, and I'll speak about my Spelman work, we typically do not charge, especially right now in this pandemic season, but typically if you want to use something, we do ask for credit in the sense of, so people will, to amplify Spelman at a Black woman's archives, and so people will know where to get, if somebody else wants to use it, so to connect back. But it's not like Holly Smith, for me, and that, so I don't. And I know often it's like, oh, well, your small archives that can help. And, there have been times where we have received donations or, depending on the nature, but typically we do not for that reason, because we get a lot of independent filmmakers or, students or people who are like, well, I want to write this article, this blog piece, please do. Here's our permission form, in the sense of permission, like, just making sure that the artist or the individual on the other end can do their due diligence with copyright, if it does, but we help and guide with that. But I feel like that's the perfect word. That is another form of colonizing our community histories, and that money and that those resources aren't going back to the community. And that is one way to really mitigate access, that you would only have access if you had the money and the funds and the clout to use these materials.
One thing that is a really interesting part of our procedures around any loans, and we do often get requests for loans of material to museums and galleries or reproductions of material. And I'll say, sure, I'm happy to help you pack that up. I'm happy to scan that for you. But most folks who approach us for a loan or for reproductions expect us to feel like we have the authority to sign off on copyright. And we make it really clear that we don't. And we'll let folks know, like, if you want to put that up in your exhibition, we're fine with that. But first, here's the creator of it. Here's her email address. She'll be really excited to hear from you, but you need to email her and forward her reply to me before I mail it to you. And folks are not always super excited about that extra work. And to be perfectly honest, it's more work on our end too. But that's the work. And we get to also have this opportunity of teaching folks that like these relationships are actually more important to us than you getting this stuff on your walls. So I'm sorry, but like this is a part of what all of this stuff means.
I don't think there's any apology needed. I like that we're keeping it real on this panel and just being real about the landscape of the work that we do. So thank you all for that answer. And to the person who asked that question, best of luck with your project. I really hope that that gets figured out, because my good God, some of the struggles that we've been talking about in our panel are manifesting in real life. So this is a timely conversation. Somebody asked a question relating to widening accessibility of history, especially in the archives, in terms of disability. So if anyone wants to or can speak to that, that's a fantastic question that I think deserves our attention.
Could you rephrase that again?
Yes, absolutely. This person talked about any experiences in widening accessibility of history in terms of disability, and perhaps the work that your archives are doing and being mindful of disability.
Well, an article came out in the New York Times maybe 3 months ago about a guy named Brad Lomax, right? And it was a maybe 3-page article on the Disabilities Act. He was a Black Panther Party member who kind of headed that in the Bay Area in the 70s. And he went to Washington, D.C. and testified before Congress. And as a result of a number of people making testimonies, they passed the Disability Act of 1977. Now, much of that material came from our archive. A lot of reporters come to our archive, begin with our archive, then they call me up and ask, you know, who was Brad and who does Brad know, who was his brother and so forth. So in terms of that kind of research, which is a constant thing almost every day. Like I have ex-prisoners who were in jail in the 70s who are out of jail now. They want some articles they wrote in the 70s for this newspaper, right? So having that information available to retrieve and give back to people is a fantastic thing, you know? I just want to say that.
Sophie, please. I got you that time.
You have a thing today.
I guess I'll just say, I mean, it's something, so we were really excited at Interference, despite, you know, the stress and uncertainty of having to move, especially having to move an archive. We were excited to finally have a storefront space. Previously, you know, I'm thinking literally the physical accessibility of the archives, which is often the biggest barrier for folks to actually get in, especially smaller institutions or small organizations that might not have a reference archivist, that might not have somebody who, if you can't come into the archive, they can do some of that research for you and hook you up with the material. So it was really great for us to finally have a space where, you know, we're on the ground floor, you can come right in the front door. We were finally able to have ADA accessible bathrooms. Like, it was really exciting. But the only other thing I'll add is, I do wonder if the pandemic has kind of cornered some archivists and some institutions into a place where they're finally having to think more proactively about making their programming accessible and making their collections accessible. Because unfortunately, I think that's how it often goes, where when abled folks or non-disabled folks, suddenly they're having the same problems that a lot of disabled folks have, where they can't get into the space, they can't get to the collections. And now all of a sudden there are so many great ideas about how to make sure that people can still get to the collection. So I'm sure it's so frustrating to see that happen, but it does, you know, the flip side of it does mean that I think more and more archives, at least in my experience, are having to think more creatively and be more engaged with this question of, okay, your collection is open to the public, and you're communicating your information clearly, but is is that real access? Is that true access? What more could we be doing to make sure that people with all different kinds of disabilities are still able to get to this material?
You know, having the ability to do Skype and Zoom is a plus factor as well, because you can actually hold documents up to the screen and say, is this what you're talking about?
That's a great point. This moment in time is causing all of us to rethink several things. Nathaniel, please.
I just wanted to just riff off both of those things and just say that I think those are really important. And because disability can manifest in so many different ways, that's not just physical. One of the things that we try to do at the Freedom Archives, and I think speaks to what was just said, is we do have a search site that is basically item level searching. And for the digitized documents that are on there, of which there are thousands, you can just click on them and download them and, you know, do with them as you would in the same kind of way that, as Holly said, with if you contacted Spelman, you know, credit us if you use it, but beyond that, like, go for it. And so obviously this opens up what are additional archival conversations around access, but I think specifically around the disability piece, that the more and more archives make things accessible to people without having to come in will be beneficial for folks who cannot come in for whatever that reason might be.
Kelechi, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add quickly to Nathaniel and Mr. Jennings' point. There was a really good workshop I attended 7 years ago, and I was frantically searching for it. So I apologize. And if anybody would like to follow up with a specific organization, please email me. But it was about accessibility in the archives, and it was led by a professor in disability studies, archivist, and it was specifically around talking about exactly what everybody was just talking about, but also in terms of digital humanities, making sure that you keep in mind, as everybody was just saying, people with different, accessibility concerns when you're doing digital projects, everything from how material presents, light, access points. And I have to say that was really wonderful and illuminating and eye-opening, because again, you think, in this day and age of being so woke and aware, it didn't occur to me in that same way to how to be cognizant of that. And they provided great resources, which I'm happy to share. But I think, like you said, just with an eye, like Mr. Jennings was saying, even we've worked, with, particular students doing transcriptions, in the physical space, making sure that the physical space, and that, something that I feel strongly about, again, in service, if a researcher comes in with a particular need, how can I, but also the institution, support it? But as we in this in digital day and age, are we creating projects really to, focus on the information, but so that the users can have the optimal accessibility experience? So again, I am happy to do the digging through my emails to really find the resources because it was an extremely helpful workshop. And Society of American Archivists does now have an accessibility issues and archive section with some resources that I think is necessary, overdue, and wonderful. And I will drop that in the chat as well.
I just wanted to add one more thing. Project Stand just started to try to tiptoe into this space about this work. We had the amazing Dr. Grayson Brillmeyer come to one of our general meetings last year. And Dr. Grayson is doing amazing work around the disabled community and scholarship. And so what I took away from that conversation is just, again, I will say with our collection assessment, so with our members, everyone has to fill out a collection assessment form to let us know what kind of holdings they have. And one of the things we do ask to find out, like, what collections do they have around the disabled community? So that's one thing we're trying to find out, like what's actually out there. But one of the things that I thought Grayson did an amazing job is reminding us, like, to not let the framework or the terminology that the able community uses to frame the disabled community, and how we need to remind ourselves that these are whole individuals and that not to let just the disability define, and then that becomes how they're represented in our archive. And so that was just a very powerful shift in conversation and refining how we should be looking at the records and how we should be documenting this community.
Thank you all so much for those answers. Let's go ahead and answer one more quick question because I see that we are getting close to time. I wish I could keep y'all here forever to keep talking, but I do want to be mindful of everyone's time on a Sunday evening. So we got a great question. This one is actually for Tiana. You got targeted for a question, but also anyone else who may be moving in traditional journalism spaces. This person asks, how did you find or build a way to document for liberation when the reporting environment is so often under white male leadership and white-oriented understandings of objectivity and limits on personal involvement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm thinking of how to answer that, especially since my introduction to a lot of this stuff was through a major institution at UC Davis. But one of the things that comes to mind is the development of podcasts. And I think that's been very influential for, how journalism has kind of evolved over time and people finding ways to include these interpersonal interviews, I did this podcast that was called Abolition Radio. And one of the things that they did was they tried to include like letters from the inside if people wanted to call in and read letters that they were getting from their loved ones, without having to kind of have this conversation about objectivity or like fact checking and going into all those things of kind of invalidating people's stories. But I definitely think it's a constant obstacle that I experience, even down to being like, okay, am I a journalist? Because the traditional journalist would be defined as this, and I'm not totally interested in all the barriers in terms of how journalism functions in the traditional sense. But I think in answering that question, I would say one of the main things was staying in touch with organizers and activists and kind of centering their voices and utilizing podcasts, as well as just doing different things with technology. Like technology is right at our fingertips. You can make documentaries, as Nathaniel was mentioning, and that can kind of function as a sort of journalism, and just, really experimenting with media and technology rather than being confined to what you mentioned, like white supremacy idea of journalism is in a traditional sense. So that would be like my advice. I'd love to hear from other people because I definitely feel like I'm still learning on how to navigate that with being in the institution, like still going to school and stuff like that.
Well, one of the things that we use as a tool is my partner is an expert editor. I mean, her skills in putting together paragraphs and sentences go beyond my skills by far. So, and I'm lucky to have that source available to me because it's necessary to make what you say very clear, and so that is a benefit that I have, and I really appreciate that.
I think when I was at school, I went to NYU, and obviously NYU has its problems. And this is gonna sound like I'm really trying to just like sell interference really hard, but I don't think I need to. So it's every word is sincere. A big part of what kind of got me through the program, which I did love and found very valuable, but both going to school and working within this enormous institution that was not particularly friendly to its students, and wasn't particularly interested in any of the things that we're talking about today. There certainly were individuals who were, but the university as a whole was discovering all of these outside, totally independent grassroots organizations like Interference Archive, like the Lesbian Her Story Archives, like these small places that were doing exactly the kind of work that I knew I wanted to get into archives to do. That was why I wanted to be in that career to begin with. And so to have the contrast, to sort of be stuck in this very, very capitalist, hierarchical structure, but knowing that there were all these other options out there. So I guess like sort of semi-related to what you're saying, Tiana, about how do you navigate getting the information you need and the skills you need from this institution that is actually pretty hostile to you and your values in many ways, is to remember to look outside of it. And that even when you're right in the middle, you don't have to spend all of your time there, and that you won't be there forever. That there are going to be a lot of people on the other side who are really interested in the work that you're doing, who want to do it with you in a much more ground up way. And that definitely kind of let me maintain a level of optimism about my career, which is nice. Those sometimes come rarely.
I am so appreciative for everyone who asked the question in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to all of them, but I hope that some of the themes of the questions that were asked have been touched on by some of the panelists earlier in our conversation. I do want to give our wonderful panelists a chance to maybe say a couple last words, last thoughts as we wrap up our panel based on the lovely conversation we've had this evening.
Well, one of the things we're working on, and it's about time, is documenting letters from political prisoners. We have over 20-something years, letters from Mumia, Angola 3, to anybody who was in jail as a political prisoner. And also we had a big Books Behind Bars program. So we're documenting letters and artwork. We have a tremendous amount of prison art and that we need to document and put somewhere, because they're from some leading political prisoners, like Mumia has been drawn. We have about 8 or 9 of his art pieces in different political prisons. So those are things we're working on right now to archive. And we need help.
Well, I just want to say, Mr. Jennings, I am down to help any way that you need. So
I already told you I'll come through an archive. Let me know.
As soon as it's safe to come through physically, I'll be there, but you let me know, seriously, whatever I can do on the East Coast. And again, just want to say thank you. Selfishly, I knew I was going to glean, well, I guess it's not selfish, but honestly, I was going to glean so much from this conversation with such amazing colleagues. So, and a huge thank you again, Tiana, Kelechi, and Hassani for facilitating this wonderful conversation and just keeping the idea again about archives, memory work being liberatory spaces and spaces for justice and community. I actually feel a tad emotional. And for those who know me, Lael, know I'm a tender heart, tender but tough, because it really is about community and engagement and building and creating something new. I think about Toni Cade Bambara, whose papers we are fortunate to steward. Revolution begins within thyself. I messed up that that paraphrase, but again, just the idea of the self-awareness and the engagement and vulnerability, words that don't get used a lot in the profession. It's very, you're supposed to be professional, whatever that means, and not show emotion. But again, speaking about my experience as a Black woman working in Black collections, there's a certain level of, trauma that not to compare with what my, the ancestors and community went through, but I hear it, I think about my own current experiences, and there's a level of space that I need to have held for me, but that I hold for all of you. So I just am elated by conversations like this, where we can connect that desire to fight with our vulnerability and our community to make archives and memory work and each other truly liberatory spaces. So again, I just thank you and look forward to our continued work.
I also want to say thank you to the organizers, and Kelechi did a fantastic job moderating. So thank you very much for that. And thanks for all the folks who tuned in and asked questions. I have three things I want to say, but they're all relatively short. And I had to really think about it because there's a lot that has been said and a lot of thinking that's been done. So I don't know what I would just leave folks with, but three things that come up to me in the work that we do at the Freedom Archives, or things that have been talked about on this panel that I would just reiterate. I think everyone has said these just in different ways. I think that we should actively use the archives to engage social issues. They shouldn't be a static space, they should be dynamic. I think repurposing is really important. And ultimately, creating a different set of material conditions is essential for this memory to be given the space it needs to thrive. The white supremacist, settler colonial capitalist state we live in is not a healthy place for people to live. And so part of this work can be cultivating a world that is healthier for people, and archives and our memories have a lot to do with that. I think this has definitely been said, always collaborate. I think this panel has been a good example of that. And then the other thing I would bring is just the concept of imagination. And the reason why I'm raising that is because I'm not one of the founders of the Freedom Archives, but I think about I work with one of them, and I think about the story of its founding. And when folks were doing the work, folks were doing journalist work in the 60s and 70s and saved their audio tapes, and that became the original iteration of the archives, but years later. And folks when they were creating those tapes and doing the work they were doing, they did not know that there was going to be a Freedom Archives. They were just engaged in movement and doing it. But I think that over time, folks had the imagination of, we know this stuff is important, we know it matters, what do we do with it? And that might not be an easy answer, and it might have taken many years, but now, 20 some years later at the Freedom Archives, we've got these wonderful, robust collections, and we're a great resource. And so I think that for all the people who are doing this work or thinking about memory work, that there has to be a level of imagination, because we might not be in a place right now where we know exactly what the impact of our work is, but certainly there will be an impact. And so we have to kind of imagine and kind of like lean into that. And so I think that just the imagination is really important. And then that will also open up in terms of how we do the work we do, because some of it is we have to imagine ways to break out of the boundaries that we exist in. So I think that that's really important in this work. And thanks everyone for creating space and being a part of this.
Okay, if no one has any other last thoughts, I think that's it. Did you have something?
One other thought, one thing.
Your thoughts.
We
Okay,
got
go
it.
ahead.
Okay.
Now, being Black August, in this 2021, this marks the 50th year since the murder and death of George Jackson. We should do something. And what that something is I don't know. But something, a slide production, a PowerPoint, an explanation of why are we doing this, but something, to celebrate, bring all this energy together into action.
Yes, we're gonna have to talk, because I was emailing you about that, but a lot of people don't know who George Jackson is, which is, another conversation. Yeah, we are gonna do it, and I hope everyone that's here already will also tune in and share when that comes. Hopefully this August. Lael, you had a thought, and then.
I just again want to say thank you to you, Tiana, Kelechi, and Hassani for bringing us all together. I've appreciated the very thoughtful and intentional conversation that you have created for us today, and the amazing questions that we got today. I just want to leave the notes that like so many times, specifically the communities that we've been talking about, Black and Brown folks, LGBTQ folks, disabled community, like we're told like our stories don't matter. Like that's what we're constantly inundated with. And so we are constantly having to push back and say that our stories do matter. And that's what makes our spaces and the work that we're doing so critical and so important. And to what Mr. Jennings said earlier, like it's not always just about the name that we can so easily recall, it is about the person that is our neighbor or that dope Black teacher we had in 5th grade. Like those stories deserve to be told and shared and passed on. So I'm just thankful for that work, and just we need to remind each other like those stories like they have value. So I mean, again, it was said earlier that I think you said that, Holly, like sometimes people don't think their stories matter, and like we have to tell them like, no, this should be kept. You deserve to be honored. You deserve to be discussed past the time that you're here on this planet and on this plane. So I'm just glad that we have a community that believes and honors that work.
Ashe. Any last words perhaps from either of you from Interference Archive? I know we've said so much, so if there are, it's okay, but I want to give the chance.
I'll just do like I mean, this is to end on a light note. I want to give like a big props to the podcast from Interference Archive, and I'll put the link to it, Audio Interference, in the chat. It's not something I can take any credit for. It's not a project here I'm involved with. That's like one of the beautiful things about non-hierarchical organizing structures, is that there can be like so many cool things happening concurrently. But reflecting back on how movement history can be generative and can inspire more organizing. I hope that, you know, I feel like we're all listening to more podcasts right now because we have no one to talk to. So take a listen, and I hope that it inspires you.
That podcast is really amazing. I've listened to it. They have a segment on archiving abolition. So if y'all should definitely listen to that podcast. But thank you all. I dropped everyone's website link in the chat if you want to check out the archives. I know some people were dropping their information in the chat. If you want to connect with them via email, you can also look at their websites and find ways to connect. But this will not be the last conversation we'll be having. We hope to have another one in the future, but thank you. This was amazing. Thank you, Kelechi. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Hassani. Thank you to everyone who attended. This will be recorded and posted in the next day. And stay up, and we will convene again at some other time. But thank you all. Bye. Have a nice Sunday, everyone.
Bye.